David Kim wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished his final set of push-ups on the dojo floor. The sound of his heavy breathing mixed with the steady thump of other students practicing their kicks against heavy bags. After 8 years of training, this place felt more like home than his actual apartment. The smell of rubber mats and the echo of bare feet on wooden floors had become as familiar as his morning coffee. "Good work tonight, David," called out Master Lee from across the room. The elderly instructor nodded approvingly as he watched David pack his gear into a worn black duffel bag. "Your form is getting sharper. Keep this up and you'll be ready for your 4th degree test next year." David smiled and bowed respectfully. At 31, he had spent nearly a third of his life perfecting his martial arts skills. What started as a way to build confidence in college had turned into something much deeper. The discipline, the focus, the feeling of complete control over his body and mind. It was addictive in the best possible way. Walking home through the busy streets of downtown Chicago, David felt that familiar sense of quiet confidence that came after a good training session. He moved differently than most people on the sidewalk. His posture was straighter, his steps more deliberate. Even in his business suit, there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he could handle whatever came his way. His phone buzzed with a text from his boss at the consulting firm. "Bangkok project approved. You leave next week, 6 months, big opportunity." David stopped walking and read it again. Thailand. He'd never been to Southeast Asia before, but he'd heard the stories from other travelers. Ancient temples, incredible, food, and a culture completely different from anything he'd experienced. The next few days flew by in a blur of passport renewals, visa applications, and project briefings. David's colleagues at Morrison & Associates were both excited and envious. The Bangkok assignment was exactly the kind of international experience that could fast-track a career. His job would be helping a major hotel chain improve their customer service systems across their Asian properties. "You're so lucky," said his cubicle neighbor Janet as she helped him sort through project files. "I've always wanted to visit Thailand. The beaches look amazing in all those travel photos." David nodded, though beaches weren't really on his mind. He was more curious about the martial arts scene there. He'd done some research and learned that Thailand was the birthplace of Muay Thai, one of the most respected fighting styles in the world. Maybe he'd have a chance to visit some local gyms and learn a few techniques. The flight to Bangkok was longer than anything David had experienced before. 14 hours of cramped airplane seats and airplane food gave him plenty of time to think about what lay ahead. He'd traveled for work before, but always to familiar places like New York or Los Angeles. This felt different. This felt like stepping into the unknown. When the plane finally touched down at Suvarnabhumi Airport, David was hit immediately by the humidity. Even inside the air-conditioned terminal, he could feel the thick, tropical air that seemed to cling to everything. The airport was massive and modern, filled with signs in Thai script that looked like beautiful, flowing artwork to his untrained eyes. His company had arranged for a driver to pick him up, and the ride into the city was like nothing he'd ever seen. Bangkok was alive in a way that Chicago never was. Motorcycles weaved between cars in patterns that seemed impossible. Street vendors set up shop on every corner, and the smell of cooking food mixed with exhaust fumes created a sensory overload that was both overwhelming and exciting. The hotel they'd booked for him was in the business district, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that could have been in any major city in the world. But step outside, and you were immediately reminded that you were somewhere completely different. The sounds were different, a mix of car horns, street vendors calling out in Thai, and the distant hum of the city's famous tuk-tuks putting along the streets. David spent his first week getting oriented with work and adjusting to the time difference. The jet lag hit him harder than expected, leaving him wide awake at 3 in the morning and fighting to stay alert during afternoon meetings. His new colleagues at the Bangkok office were friendly and professional, though he quickly realized that the business culture here was more formal than what he was used to back home. By his second weekend, David was finally feeling human again. The work was interesting but demanding, and he was eager to explore the city beyond the business district. He'd been reading travel guides and had made a list of must-see places. At the top of that list was the Grand Palace, described in every guidebook as the crown jewel of Bangkok's historical sites. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear, with the kind of blue sky that made David grateful he'd decided to venture out early. He'd learned that Bangkok's heat could be brutal by midday, so he planned to do his sightseeing in the cooler morning hours. He dressed casually but respectfully, long pants and a collared shirt, as recommended by his travel guide for visiting religious sites. The taxi ride to the Grand Palace took him through parts of Bangkok he hadn't seen before. Away from the modern business district, the city showed its age and character. Ancient buildings stood next to modern shops, and narrow alleyways branched off from main roads like veins from arteries. Everywhere he looked, there were small details that reminded him how far from home he really was. As the taxi pulled up to the palace entrance, David was struck by the sheer scale of the place. Massive walls surrounded what looked like an entire city within the city. Golden spires and colorful roofs peeked over the walls, giving hints of the wonders that lay inside. Even from the street, he could see crowds of tourists gathering near the entrance, cameras ready and guidebooks in hand. The entrance fee was modest, and David joined the stream of visitors making their way through the gates. Inside, the palace complex was even more impressive than he'd imagined. Every surface seemed to be decorated with intricate carvings, gold leaf or colorful tiles. The architecture was unlike anything he'd seen before, a mixture of Thai, Chinese, and European influences that created something entirely unique. David found himself walking slower than usual, trying to take in all the details. His usual confident stride was replaced by the careful steps of someone who didn't want to miss anything important. He pulled out his phone to take photos, like every other tourist, but quickly realized that pictures couldn't capture the scale and beauty of what he was seeing. The crowds were thick, especially around the most famous buildings. Tour groups moved in organized clusters, following guides who held small flags or umbrellas to keep their groups together. Individual travelers like David wove between these groups, sometimes getting caught up in the flow of people moving from one attraction to the next. As he approached the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, considered the most sacred site within the palace complex, David noticed the security presence becoming more obvious. Men in crisp white uniforms stood at various points throughout the complex, their posture rigid and their eyes constantly scanning the crowds. These weren't regular security guards or police officers. These were the royal guards he'd read about, elite soldiers chosen to protect Thailand's most important cultural and religious sites. David had read that these guards were mostly ceremonial, but looking at them now, he could see they were serious professionals. Their uniforms were immaculate. Their bearing was military perfect, and despite the heat, not one of them showed any sign of discomfort or fatigue. They stood like statues, barely acknowledging the thousands of tourists who walked past them every day. Little did David know that in just a few minutes his peaceful morning of sightseeing would turn into something that would change his life forever. The morning sun was getting stronger as David made his way deeper into the palace complex. Sweat was already forming on his forehead, and he could see other tourists fanning themselves with their guidebooks. The heat in Bangkok was something else entirely, thick and heavy like walking through warm soup. He paused near an ornate golden building to check his map. The Temple of the Emerald Buddha was just ahead, and according to his guidebook, it was the absolute must-see attraction. In the entire complex, David folded the map and started walking toward the temple, weaving between tour groups and families taking photos. That's when he first noticed the guard. The man stood perfectly still near the temple entrance, wearing a pristine white uniform, with golden details that caught the sunlight. His black boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his hat sat at a precise angle that suggested military training. Unlike the other guards David had seen, this one seemed more alert, his dark eyes constantly scanning the crowd of tourists. His name was Sergeant Chanchai Ratanakorn, though David didn't know that yet. Chanchai had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years, after spending nearly a decade in the Thai army. At 35, he was older than most of the other guards, and he took his duties more seriously than some of his younger colleagues thought necessary. This particular morning, Chanchai was dealing with more stress than usual. His elderly father had been in the hospital for 2 weeks with a serious heart condition, and the doctors weren't giving the family much hope. Chanchai had requested leave to spend time with his father, but his supervisor had denied it, saying they were short-staffed due to the increased tourist season. The combination of worry about his father and frustration with his work situation had left Chanchai on edge. He'd been snapping at his fellow guards and treating tourists with less patience than usual. His commanding officer had already spoken to him twice about his attitude, but Chanchai couldn't seem to shake the feeling that everything was going wrong at once. David approached the temple entrance, his camera ready. The building was absolutely stunning, covered in gold and colorful tiles that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. He wanted to get closer for a better photo, maybe capture some of the intricate details that made this place so special. As he stepped forward, raising his camera, Chanchai moved into his path. The guard said something in Thai, his voice sharp and commanding. David didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. He was being told to stop or move back. David looked around confused. Other tourists were taking photos nearby, and no one else seemed to be having problems. He pointed to his camera and then to the temple, trying to communicate that he just wanted to take a picture. Chanchai shook his head firmly and said something else in Thai, this time louder and more insistent. The language barrier was frustrating for both men. David's jet lag was still affecting him, making it harder to think clearly and be patient. He'd been looking forward to this moment all week, and now he was being stopped for reasons he couldn't understand. Meanwhile, Chanchai was interpreting David's confusion as defiance, seeing another disrespectful tourist who thought the rules didn't apply to him. David tried to step around the guard, thinking maybe he'd misunderstood where he was supposed to stand. This was a mistake. In Thai culture, and especially in the context of royal protocol, persistence in the face of authority was seen as deeply disrespectful. Chanchai's training kicked in, and he moved to block David's path more definitively. "Sir, no photo," Chanchai said in heavily accented English, one of the few phrases he knew. He held up his hand in a stop gesture that was universal in meaning. But David was getting frustrated now. He'd paid the entrance fee like everyone else. He was being respectful, and he couldn't understand why this one guard was giving him such a hard time when other tourists were freely taking photos just a few feet away. The heat wasn't helping. His mood, and the combination of jet lag, stress from his new job, and general culture shock was making him less diplomatic than he normally would have been. "I just want one photo," David said, speaking slowly and pointing again to his camera. "One photo, okay?" Chanchai didn't understand most of the English, but he understood the tone. This tourist was arguing with him, challenging his authority, at one of Thailand's most sacred sites. In his current state of mind, dealing with worry about his father and frustration with his job, this felt like the last straw. The guard stepped closer to David, close enough that David could smell his cologne, mixed with the starch from his uniform. Chanchai spoke again in Thai, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat. He gestured firmly toward the area where other tourists were standing, making it clear that David needed to move away from the temple entrance. David felt his personal space being invaded. In his martial arts training, one of the first things he'd learned was to recognize when someone was trying to intimidate you physically. The guard's body language, the forward stance, the direct eye contact, the way he'd moved into David's space, triggered every alarm bell in David's head. This was the moment when 8 years of martial arts training worked against him instead of for him. His body had been conditioned to respond automatically to perceived threats. When Chanchai reached out and placed his hand firmly on David's chest, pushing him backward, David's training took over before his mind could intervene. The reaction was instant and devastating. David's left hand came up to deflect the guard's arm while his right leg snapped forward in a perfect front kick. It was a technique he'd practiced thousands of times in the dojo, a move that had become as natural as breathing. His foot connected squarely with Chanchai's face just below his left eye. The sound of the impact echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Chanchai's head snapped back, and his pristine white hat flew off as he stumbled backward. His polished, black boots scrambled for purchase on the smooth stone floor, but he couldn't maintain his balance. He crashed into one of the ornate pillars that supported the temple roof. his shoulder hitting the carved stone with a sickening thud. Blood immediately began flowing from Chanchai's nose, dark red drops staining the front of his white uniform. His left eye was already beginning to swell, and there was a cut on his cheek where David's shoe had scraped across his face. The entire courtyard went silent for a heartbeat. Then the chaos began. A woman screamed. Phones appeared from everywhere as tourists started recording. David stood frozen, his leg still raised from the kick, his mind trying to process what had just happened. The automatic response that had served him so well in sparring matches and belt tests had just turned him into an international incident. Other guards came running from all directions, their polished boots clicking against the stone as they surrounded David. Tourists backed away, creating a circle around the scene while continuing to film everything. David could hear people speaking in different languages, English, Chinese, German, but he couldn't focus on any of it. Chanchai was struggling to get back on his feet, one hand pressed to his bleeding nose while the other reached for support against the pillar. His eyes were watering from the pain, but David could see something else there too, shock and humiliation. This man who had stood so perfectly at attention just moments before was now hurt and embarrassed in front of hundreds of strangers. Sorry, David said, finally finding his voice. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. But the words felt completely inadequate for what had just happened. More security personnel arrived, including officials in different uniforms who were clearly higher ranking than the regular guards. David could hear radios crackling with urgent Thai conversations. Someone was calling for medical assistance. Someone else was probably calling the police. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, David realized that his life had just changed forever. He'd come to Bangkok for a career, opportunity, and a chance to experience a new culture. Instead, he'd just committed what might be considered an act of violence against a representative of the Thai royal family, in one of the country's most sacred places, in front of hundreds of witnesses with cameras. The morning that had started with such promise was about to become a nightmare that would test everything he thought he knew about himself. The next few hours passed in a blur of chaos and confusion. David found himself surrounded by Thai officials in different uniforms, all speaking rapidly in a language he couldn't understand. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and he was escorted through the palace complex as hundreds of tourists watched with their cameras still recording. The ride to the police station was surreal. Bangkok traffic, which had seemed exciting during his taxi ride to the palace, now felt like a prison sentence being extended one red light at a time. David sat in the back of the police van, trying to process what had just happened. Just 3 hours ago, he'd been a successful consultant enjoying a weekend of sightseeing. Now he was facing charges in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language or understand the legal system. The police station was nothing like what David had expected. It was older and more crowded than American police stations he'd seen in movies. Officers moved between desks covered in paperwork, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of strong coffee. Everyone stared at him as he was led through the main room. The foreign tourist who had assaulted a royal guard, Detective Inspector Somchai Pruksachat, was assigned to David's case. A 20-year veteran of the Bangkok Metropolitan Police, Inspector Somchai had seen plenty of tourist incidents over the years. Bar fights, passport problems, minor theft cases. These were routine. But an assault on a royal guard at the Grandi Palace? This was different. This was the kind of case that could make or break careers. Inspector Somchai was a methodical man who spoke decent English, having dealt with international cases before. As he reviewed the initial police report, he shook his head slowly. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple video recordings from tourists' phones showed the entire incident from different angles. There was no question about what had happened. David had kicked a royal guard in the face at Thailand's most sacred site. "Mr. Kim," Inspector Somchai said during their first interview, "do you understand the seriousness of what you have done?" David sat across from him in a small, windowless room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. He'd been given a cup of water and a chance to call his embassy, but everything still felt like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. "I understand I hurt someone," David replied quietly, "and I'm truly sorry about that, but it was self-defense." He pushed me first. Inspector Somchai leaned back in his metal chair. Self-defense? Mr. Kim, you are a trained martial artist. The guard is in the hospital with a broken nose and possible concussion. This does not look like self-defense to most people. The word hospital hit David like a physical blow. In all his years of training, he'd never seriously injured anyone. Sparring in the dojo was controlled, safe, with protective gear and rules. The idea that his automatic response had put someone in the hospital made him feel sick. How bad is he hurt? David asked. Bad enough, but that is not your biggest problem. Inspector Somchai opened a thick folder and pulled out several photographs. Do you know where you committed this assault? David nodded. The Grand Palace. Not just the Grand Palace, the Temple of the Emerald Buddha, the most sacred Buddhist site in all of Thailand. And you attacked a royal guard, a man sworn to protect our most important cultural treasures. The inspector explained what David was facing. In Thailand, crimes against royal property or personnel were taken extremely seriously. The prosecutor was considering multiple charges: assault, disturbing the peace at a religious site, and potentially even lèse-majesté, a crime, against the monarchy itself. Lèse-majesté? David's voice cracked. What does that mean? It means insulting or threatening the royal family or royal institutions. Royal guards represent the crown. Some people are saying your attack was an attack on Thailand itself. Ear felt the walls of the small room closing in around him. That's insane. I was just trying to take a photo. I didn't even know who he was specifically. But Inspector Somchai had more bad news. The story was already spreading on social media. Videos of the incident were being shared thousands of times with headlines like American tourist attacks Thai, Royal Guard and foreigner shows disrespect at Sacred Temple. The Thai media was picking up the story, and public opinion was not on David's side. Meanwhile, David's company was scrambling to respond. His boss, Richard Morrison, received a call from the Thai office on Sunday evening Bangkok time. The conversation was brief and devastating. David did what? Richard asked, hoping he'd misunderstood. He kicked a royal guard in the face at the Grand Palace, repeated Kwanchai, the Bangkok office manager. It's all over Thai social media. The videos are everywhere. Richard immediately called the company's legal department. Morrison and Associates had spent months building relationships with their Thai clients. This kind of international incident could destroy years of careful business development. The legal team's advice was swift and brutal. Distance the company from David's actions immediately. By Monday morning, David learned that his employment had been terminated effective immediately. The company issued a public statement expressing their shock and disappointment at his actions, emphasizing that his behavior did not represent company values. The statement was translated into Thai and distributed to local media outlets. David's assigned lawyer was Panita Sukum, a sharp woman in her 40s who specialized in international legal issues. She met with David on Tuesday, 3 days after the incident, and her assessment was grim. I've reviewed all the evidence, she told him in the same interview room where he'd met with Inspector Somchai. The videos are very clear. You kicked the guard with significant force. He was hospitalized. This happened at the Grand Palace. But he pushed me first, David insisted. The videos show some physical contact, yes, but Thai law and culture view this very differently than American law. A royal guard telling you to move away from a restricted area is not assault. Your response was extremely disproportionate. Panita explained the Thai legal system. Unlike the American system David was familiar with, Thai courts placed heavy emphasis on social harmony and respect for authority. Foreign tourists who showed disrespect to Thai cultural institutions were rarely treated leniently. What's the worst-case scenario? David asked. If they pursue all charges, including lèse-majesté, you could face 15 years in prison. 15 years. The number hit David like a physical blow. He'd be nearly 50 when he got out. His career would be over. His life as he knew it would be finished. But Panita had been studying the case carefully and she'd found some interesting details. The guard, Sergeant Chanchai, had deviated from standard protocol during the incident. Royal guards were trained in de-escalation techniques. and security footage showed that Chanchai had been more aggressive than necessary. More importantly, Panida had learned about Chanchai's personal situation. His father had died the day after the incident, just hours after Chanchai was released from the hospital. The stress of dealing with his father's illness, combined with being denied leave, had clearly affected the guard's judgment that morning. "This doesn't excuse what you did," Panida explained. "But it might help explain why the situation escalated. Both of you made mistakes that day." She also discovered something else interesting. Several tourists who witnessed the incident had contacted the Thai embassy in their home countries, expressing concern about what they'd seen. Some felt that the guard had been unnecessarily aggressive before David's reaction. A few had even posted supportive comments on social media. Though these were vastly outnumbered by critical ones, there might be a path forward, Panida told David. But it requires admitting your mistake and showing genuine understanding of Thai culture. The prosecutor might consider reducing charges if you can demonstrate real remorse and cultural learning. David spent his first week in detention thinking about everything that had led to this moment. His martial arts training, which had been such a source of pride and confidence, had betrayed him at the worst possible moment. His automatic response to a perceived threat had turned a simple misunderstanding into an international incident. But, as he sat in his cell listening to the sounds of Bangkok traffic outside, David began to understand something important. This wasn't just about legal consequences anymore. It was about taking responsibility for his actions and finding a way to make things right, not just for himself, but for Sergeant Chanchai and everyone else affected by that terrible morning at the palace. 3 weeks into his detention, David had fallen into a routine that helped him stay sane. Wake up at 6, exercise in his small cell, eat the simple breakfast of rice and vegetables, then spend hours thinking about his situation. The Bangkok detention center was crowded and noisy, filled with people from all walks of life who had found themselves on the wrong side of Thai law. His cellmate was a German backpacker named Klaus, who'd been caught with marijuana at the airport. Klaus had been there for 2 months and had become something of an expert on the Thai legal system. "The key," Klaus told him one evening, "is to show them you understand their culture. They don't just want punishment, they want respect." David had been thinking about respect a lot lately. In his martial arts training, respect was everything. Respect for your teacher, respect for your fellow students, respect for the art itself. But somehow, in that moment at the palace, all of that had been forgotten. His body had reacted before his mind could engage, and now he was paying the price. That's when the guard came to tell him he had a visitor. David expected to see his lawyer, Panida, or maybe someone from the American embassy. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with Sergeant Chanchai Ratnakorn, the man he'd kicked just 3 weeks earlier. The meeting room was small and stark, with just a metal table and 2 plastic chairs. Chanchai sat across from David, and for a moment neither man spoke. The guard's face still showed signs of their encounter, a faint bruise around his left eye and a small scar on his cheek where David's shoe had scraped his skin. David had rehearsed this moment in his head dozens of times, but now that it was happening, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you." Chanchai studied David's face for a long moment. When he spoke, his English was careful and measured, clearly something he'd been practicing. "I have been learning your language," he said slowly. "I want to understand what happened that day." David was surprised. He'd expected anger, maybe even threats. Instead, he saw something in Chanchai's eyes that looked almost like curiosity. "You've been learning English?" "Yes. I want to know why you did what you did." In Thailand, we believe that understanding comes before forgiveness. What followed was the most important conversation of David's life. Chanchai explained what it meant to be a royal guard, the honor and responsibility that came with protecting Thailand's most sacred places. He talked about the months of training, the pride his family felt when he was selected for the position, and the shame he felt at being defeated by a tourist in front of hundreds of people. "But I also want to understand your training," Chanchai continued. The way you moved, the technique you used. This was not the action of an angry tourist. This was the reaction of someone with real skill. David found himself talking about his 8 years of martial arts training, the discipline it had taught him, and the automatic responses that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of practice. It wasn't a choice, he explained. When you pushed me, my body just reacted. 8 years of training took over before my brain could stop it. Changchai nodded slowly. I understand this. I have been training in Muay Thai since I was 12 years old. Sometimes the body moves faster than the mind. You're a fighter? David asked. I was. Before the army, I competed in local matches. I even won a few championships in my province. Changchai smiled slightly, the first time David had seen any warmth in his expression. Your technique was very good. Clean and fast. I was not prepared for someone with real training. As they continued talking, both men began to realize how similar they actually were. Both had dedicated their lives to martial arts. Both understood discipline and respect. Both had let their training down in that moment at the palace, David by not controlling his automatic responses, and Changchai by letting his personal stress affect his professional behavior. I must tell you something, Changchai said after they'd been talking for over an hour. That day at the palace, I was not myself. My father was very sick in the hospital. I had asked for leave to be with him, but my supervisor said no. I was angry and worried, and I took those feelings out on you. David felt a chill run down his spine. Your father, how is he now? Changchai's expression grew sad. He died the day after our incident. While I was in the hospital getting my nose fixed, he passed away. I never got to say goodbye. The weight of this revelation hit David like a physical blow. While he'd been worried about his legal troubles and his ruined career, this man had been dealing with the death of his father. I'm so sorry, David said, and meant it more than any apology he'd ever given. I can't imagine what that must have been like. It was very hard, Changchai admitted. But talking to you today, I think my father would want me to find a way forward. He always said that holding on to anger only hurts yourself. They talked for 2 more hours, sharing stories about their training, their families, and their dreams. Changchai had wanted to open his own martial arts school after retiring from the Royal Guard. David talked about how martial arts had given him confidence and discipline, but also how he'd maybe become too confident in his abilities. I've been thinking, Changchai said as their meeting was winding down. What happened between us was wrong, but maybe we can make something right from it. What do you mean? I've been talking to my commanding officer about your case. The prosecutor wants to make an example of you, but I don't think that serves anyone. You made a mistake, but you're not a bad person. I can see that now. Changchai explained that he was willing to speak to the court on David's behalf, but only if David was willing to truly understand what he'd done wrong and make amends in a meaningful way. The Thai justice system isn't just about punishment, Changchai continued. It's about harmony and making things right. If you're willing to learn about our culture and show real respect for what you damaged, I think there might be another way. David felt a spark of hope for the first time since the incident. What would I need to do? First, you would need to publicly acknowledge your mistake and show genuine understanding of Thai culture. Second, you would need to do something to give back to our community. And third, Changchai paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. I would like to train with you. Train with me? Yes. I want to learn your style of martial arts, and I can teach you traditional Muay Thai. If we train together, it shows that we have turned conflict into cooperation. This is very important in Thai culture. The idea was so unexpected that David needed a moment to process it. The man he'd assaulted was offering to train with him, to help him understand Thai culture, and to speak on his behalf in court. It was more kindness than he deserved, and he knew it. Why would you do this for me? David asked. Changchai was quiet for a long moment. Because I think you and I are not so different. We both love martial arts. We both made mistakes that day, and I think we both want to be better than our worst moment. When their meeting ended, David felt something he hadn't experienced since the incident: genuine hope. Not just hope for a reduced sentence or a way out of his legal troubles, but hope that he could actually make things right. The road ahead would be difficult, and there were no guarantees about how the court case would turn out. But for the first time in weeks, David felt like he had a chance to redeem himself. As he was escorted back to his cell, David thought about what Chanchai had said about being better than your worst moment. Maybe this was his chance to prove that the incident at the palace didn't define who he really was. The next few weeks changed everything for David. True to his word, Chanchai spoke with the prosecutor and requested that the charges be reduced from assault on a royal guard to cultural misunderstanding and public disturbance. It wasn't a complete dismissal, but it meant David was looking at months instead of years in prison. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Judge Siriporn Chaizeri, agreed to consider the reduced charges, but only if David could prove he genuinely understood the cultural significance of his actions. This meant more than just saying sorry. He needed to demonstrate real learning and give back to the Thai community. David's lawyer, Panida, worked out an unusual arrangement. While his case moved through the courts, David would be released under supervision to participate in a community service program. He would work with local organizations, learn Thai language and culture, and most importantly, train with Chanchai to show that their conflict had been transformed into cooperation. The first place David volunteered was at a community center in one of Bangkok's older neighborhoods. The center served low-income families, providing after-school programs for children and job training for adults. The director, a kind elderly woman named Ajarn Mali, was initially skeptical about having the infamous palace kicker volunteer at her center. "These children look up to role models," she told Panida during their first meeting. "How do I explain that their new volunteer teacher is someone who attacked a guard at our most sacred site?" But Ajarn Mali was also a practical woman who needed help. The center was understaffed, and David's offer to teach basic self-defense classes to the children was something they couldn't afford to hire someone else to do. David's first day at the center was nerve-wracking. Word had spread about who he was, and many of the parents were curious to see the American who had caused such a stir. About 15 children, ages 8 to 14, gathered in the center's small gymnasium for his first class. "Hello," David said in his carefully practiced Thai. "My name is David. I'm here to teach you about staying safe." His pronunciation was terrible, and several of the children giggled, but there was no malice in it. Teaching children was completely different from training in an adult dojo. These kids had no formal martial arts background, and many came from families that couldn't afford proper sports equipment. David had to be creative, using games and simple exercises to teach basic concepts like balance, awareness, and confidence. One of his students was a shy 10-year-old boy named Niran, who was often bullied at school for being smaller than his classmates. During their third week of classes, Niran approached David after the lesson. "Teacher David," he said in broken English, "the big boys at school, they push me. What do I do?" David knelt down to Niran's eye level. This was exactly the kind of situation his own martial arts training was meant to address. Not attacking others, but protecting yourself and avoiding conflict. "First," David said slowly, "you try to walk away. Fighting should always be the last choice, not the first." He spent extra time with Niran, teaching him how to project confidence through posture and eye contact, how to de-escalate situations with calm words, and only as a last resort, basic defensive moves. The irony wasn't lost on David that he was teaching a child the very lessons he'd failed to remember at the palace. Meanwhile, his training sessions with Chanchai were becoming the highlight of his weeks. They met 3 times a week at a traditional Muay Thai gym in downtown Bangkok. The gym was old and basic: concrete floors, heavy bags hung from the ceiling, and the constant sound of gloves hitting pads. Chanchai was an excellent teacher, patient, and thorough in his explanations of traditional Thai fighting techniques. But more than that, he helped David understand the cultural context behind the martial arts. In Thailand, Muay Thai wasn't just about fighting. It was about respect, tradition, and spiritual discipline. Before every match, Chanchai explained as he demonstrated the traditional Wai Kru Ram Muay dance. Fighters perform this ritual to honor their teachers and ask for protection. In Thai martial arts, the spiritual aspect is just as important as the physical. David found himself learning not just new fighting techniques but a completely different approach to martial arts. His Korean-style training had emphasized precision, power, and individual achievement. Thai martial arts emphasized flow, adaptability, and connection to tradition and community. "Your kick that day was very powerful," Chanchai said during one of their training sessions. "But power without wisdom is dangerous. In Thailand, we say that the best fighter is one who never has to fight." As word spread about their unusual partnership, local media began to take notice. A reporter from Bangkok Post wrote a feature story about the American tourist and Thai guard who had turned their conflict into friendship. The story was picked up by international media, and suddenly David found himself representing something larger than his own legal troubles. The attention wasn't all positive. Some Thai social media users criticized Chanchai for befriending the man who had assaulted him. Some Americans thought David was being too submissive to Thai culture, but many people on both sides saw their partnership as an example of how understanding and respect could overcome cultural differences. When David's court date finally arrived 6 months after the original incident, the courthouse was packed with reporters and curious onlookers. Judge Siriporn had reviewed all the evidence, including video testimonials from the children at the community center and statements from Chanchai about David's cultural learning. "Mr. Kim," the judge said in English, "you committed a serious offense at one of our most sacred sites. Your actions showed disrespect for Thai culture and injured a dedicated public servant." David felt his heart pounding as he waited for his sentence. "However," the judge continued, "the court has also seen evidence of genuine remorse and significant efforts to understand and contribute to Thai society. Sergeant Chanchai's testimony about your character and the positive impact you've had on local children has been very influential." The final sentence was time served plus 1 year of continued community service in Thailand. David would need to continue his work at the community center and maintain his cultural education. More importantly, he was required to give a public speech about cultural understanding and conflict resolution. The speech took place at Chulalongkorn University, one of Thailand's most prestigious schools. David spoke in Thai, though his accent was still thick and he occasionally had to pause to find the right words. "6 months ago, I came to Thailand as a tourist who thought he understood respect," he began. "I learned that real respect isn't something you can read about in a guidebook. It has to be lived and practiced every day." He talked about his friendship with Chanchai, the lessons he'd learned from the children at the community center, and how martial arts had taught him that true strength comes from understanding, not from fighting. "I cannot undo what happened at the Grand Palace," David concluded, "but I can promise to spend the rest of my time in Thailand earning the respect I should have shown from the beginning." After the speech, Chanchai joined David on stage. Together, they performed a brief martial arts demonstration, showing techniques from both Thai and Korean traditions. The performance was symbolic, 2 different fighting styles working together in harmony. A year later, David was still in Bangkok. His original job was long gone, but he'd found work with an international organization that helped train conflict resolution programs. His experience had taught him that the most important battles weren't fought with fists, but with patience, understanding, and the willingness to admit when you're wrong. Chanchai had become more than a training partner. He was David's closest friend in Thailand. They opened a small martial arts school together, teaching both traditional Muay Thai and Korean-style techniques to local children and international students. "You know," Chanchai said one evening as they locked up their school, "I'm glad you kicked me that day." David looked at him in surprise. "Really?" "Yes. If you hadn't, we never would have met. We never would have learned that 2 people from different worlds could become brothers through understanding." David smiled, remembering the angry, frightened man he'd been in that detention center. "My black belt taught me how to fight," he said, "but you taught me when not to."